Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horn, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horn, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast with Mike Horn. I am absolutely delighted to have in our virtual studio today Brenda Pak. And she is co-founder and CEO of Backpac. It's a platform whose mission is to deliver diversity, equity, and inclusion analytics and data to inform diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and culture building within corporations. She's recently been featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur, and Thrive Global on her perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion, social impact, and employee engagement. And before founding Backpac, Brenda worked in several Fortune 500 companies. She's held positions in management consulting, investment banking, and brand management. And she's worked in several nonprofits, including the United Nations. So I'm so delighted again to have Brenda Pak in the virtual studio today. And Brenda, why don't you say a few words about yourself to our audience?
Yeah, that's when I have the bio written down like that, I always think, wow, I've done a lot, even though every day it feels like I haven't done much. I'm so happy to be here. My life's passion is to increase diversity and inclusion within the workplace, and I'm excited to chat about it today.
And you'll be able to find out more about Backpac and Brenda's work at backpac.co. So BACKPAC.co. So back and then pack without the CPAC.co, backpac.co. And you'll find it all in the show notes for everyone in our audience. So Brenda, what led you to Backpac?
Oh my goodness, I have so many stories. So before Backpac, I had a different life. I was an investment banker. I worked in consulting. I worked in fashion, and I did all these things. But one thing that was very common was that in each of these cultures, work cultures, I felt very much like an outsider. As a woman and who is also a minority, it didn't feel like a safe place to work. And that was a very common thread throughout it. I can just give you one example. So when I was working in investment banking, I have several examples here, but I had a manager who was an ex-football player at Harvard. And so he had a lot of aggression still. And, obviously he went into finance. And whenever he was not pleased about something, he would go back into his office and throw things and yell at his computer screen and pound on the table, thinking that we couldn't hear him. And so little things like that, I think, caused a lot of anxiety in the workplace. And I was the only woman in that office. And so the men were thinking, great, this is, a good way to bring out aggression, which perpetuated this kind of culture. And whereas I, as the only woman, felt in many ways unsafe and unable to bring my whole self to work. And so really a lot of these experiences accumulated into Backpac, thinking, okay, if I can help just one person in the workplace not feel like what I did, then I've completed my mission.
And you're working in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging or belongingness. And many companies today recognize diversity and inclusion for the massive benefits that are available to business. But companies recognize that diversity and inclusion are only half of the story. and it's important to think about equity and belongingness. How do you help others to do that?
Yeah, I think I would have to say mainly through data and our data analytics. I think one missing gap within companies is that they think that DEI is a great idea, but they don't know how to implement it and they don't have the story behind it to, justify the costs of it. And so we come in and we do a full sweep of just geography, the people, the diversity, race, gender, all of these things, and we fill in those missing stories. And so with this data, we're able to have more equitable outcomes and show gaps where maybe, for instance, like your marketing, your finance team is predominantly men. Let's think about why it's predominantly men, or maybe it's predominantly, one's race. Why is that? And just kind of help build that story so that executives and C-suite leaders know that, hey, this is a real thing and this is something that you need if your company is going to prosper in the future.
Why is it that there is so much lack of understanding about diversity, inclusion, equity, and belongingness? What fuels that?
Oh my goodness. This is, this is a question I've been grappling with now for many years, but I've noticed a pattern, which is when I meet with like C-suite executives, the executives are still predominantly white male, and they're of a different generation where things were done differently. And so I'm going in as a younger female Asian, startup co-founder and telling them, hey, DEI actually matters in today's day. And they don't understand it. They're saying when they were growing up, they didn't have, these issues. They didn't have this need to, focus on diversity. It doesn't feel like it's really a business need. How is this increasing profitability? And so they just don't feel that need. And so even if employees at the bottom and maybe middle management who are younger are yelling DEI, DEI, it's not really reaching the ears of executives at the top. And so I think that's where the gap is.
And what kind of metrics do we need to identify loopholes in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategies?
Yeah. So one thing that Backpac does is it tells you a story with the data. And so it provides you a platform that, by race, by gender, by age, by even generations, tells you who is getting promoted, whose salaries are being increased, who's, leaving the company after a certain tenure. And so our analytics is able to even accurately predict turnover rates. So we can tell you which race is going to turn over when, which gender is going to turn over when, and kind of provide you that insight so that okay, who do we need to pay attention to? Why must, they be leaving? All these things.
You mentioned on your website about the lack of DEIB related technologies. Can you say some more about that?
So I can talk a little bit about that. In the last 5 years, I would say more companies have been coming up the ladder. Ever since, COVID, George Floyd, all of those kind of instigators that really brought DEI to the forefront. So people are paying more attention now. Before, there were a couple legacy companies like Benevity that had built a system of social impact, CSR systems, different things. And now they're switching over to DEI. But it really was because there was no demand. People didn't place an importance on these things. And it wasn't integral to the value system of companies.
That's great. And how do we help, or how do you and Backpac help leaders to prioritize DEIB?
Yeah. So we really do it in 3 different pillars. I think the first thing, again, is we look at the data. We look at what do you have right now and what state are you in? And then we talk about the future and we talk about where do you want to go? What kind of culture do you want to build? And then from there, we build out a DEI program for them. And this program includes monthly content, cultural celebrations, events, speaker series. For instance, one of the companies we've been helping, we brought in Dr. Kendi, which is the author of How to Be Anti-Racist, something like that. But basically, these speakers are really changing how employees are thinking about DEI. And then the third way is our social impact programming. So we believe that DEI is not just about content and education. We believe it's about action. And so we're one of the few companies that integrates social impact programming into our DEI programming. And what this means is, one, donations. So donations to nonprofits easily through our platform. People can go directly and donate an amount. They don't have to go to another website. So it's seamless. And then on the back end, we help companies match that so that, financial systems, accountings, they're all integrated. And on top of that, one thing we do that's very special is that we link donation to current events. So for instance, the headlines right now is the 7.7, earthquake that happened in Turkey and Syria, and 2,000 people are dead, and 10,000 people are injured. So right now we've already started mobilizing a program where we can help on the ground nonprofits through donations from our clients.
Oh, that's wonderful. And in your work, you lay out 10 ways to promote diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging in the workplace. And part of it is maybe relates to what you just suggested, is about creating employee-led task forces. Can you say some more about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. At the end of the day, as much as I want Backpac to exist forever, I'm hoping that we become obsolete. And I'm hoping that other DEI companies become obsolete because companies decide it's my DNA and employees start taking up work. So the ways we've seen this is we have a system that helps employee resource groups, which means Asians at, Black, Latino, X at, and these employee groups go into our system and they start finding resources, start making events, and start tracking their memberships through our platform. And so we found that once a couple of these groups get started on our platform, people start raising their hand. And so recently we created a single parents at whatever company that is, neurodiversity at. And so people are really raising their hand to become more active and self kind of sustained.
And as you do that, how do you help employers to create more inclusive workplace policies?
Yeah. So actually, one of the activities that we do, this is not necessarily my favorite thing to do, but we often go through the employee handbook and we kind of think through what they've laid out. And we start thinking about what DEI initiatives can we start integrating into these systems and what inclusivity measures we can have. So for instance, I work with a startup that works with fertility in women who have trouble, getting pregnant, who have trouble, just with fertilization. And so what we do is we might integrate some of these programmings for employees within a company. So we try to make it as inclusive as possible.
Oh, that's great. And as you do that, I guess sometimes in certain situations, not the one that you just described, but some of these more inclusive workplace policies would require the promotion of pay equity. I mean, the imbalances are just striking, relative to the way our society is stratified and structural inequality is built into it. How do you work with others in promoting pay equity, particularly as you're working on changing or developing more inclusive workplace policies?
Yeah, so again, it comes back to the data. And because we have a plethora of data just from different types of company, we also use that data to benchmark companies against similar companies. And it's interesting that you talk about that pay equity because I was recently working with a company where we had the data to show that the Black groups within that company and the Latina X groups in that company were not given equal promotion and equal pay. And it was very, very evident by the graph that white males were given more pay, and then it was the white females, and then the minorities were significantly lower. And so because of that, we were able to make an argument that there was a gap in the system and we needed to rectify it.
Oh, that's great. And, as this occurs too, I wonder how we are helping people to be more aware of unconscious bias and to eliminate it in workplaces. Some of that stems from, how we program things, how we think about AI and its impact on equity in the workplace. But how do you think about that in terms of, being aware of unconscious bias and how we eliminate it?
This is one of my favorite topics. We have something called inclusion nudges at Backpac. So we've worked with the top 3 consulting companies and several universities in the Midwest to construct a program, basically a training program where we condense hour-long trainings that you would have to sit at your computer and do into bite-sized educational pieces that people can consume right away. And one of the biases, so we would send this weekly or monthly, but one of the biases I want to give you an example of is that, did you know in the workplace that there's something called housework within the workplace? And so often women are given more of this housework than men. So let's say you walk into a meeting, you and I, and then Mike, you tell me, oh, Brenda, you have such good handwriting. Why don't you take the notes for this meeting? And so that happens more often than not, where women are becoming the note takers, or someone will say, hey, you have really good taste. Why don't you order lunch for this meeting? And so women are doing more work without getting double the pay for all this extra work that they're doing. And they also lift their hands way more for social impact work, for DEI work. And so they're really doing a lot. And so this biases is one of our small bites that we try to recognize and to send out to companies so that they can go in and change that kind of culture.
Wow, that's great. And as you're doing that, as you're working with unconscious bias and the ways to eliminate it, I guess hand in hand, you also want to make sure that you're strengthening an organization's anti-discriminatory policies. And how would you go about doing that as well, Brenda?
We do it through a lot of speaker series. We found that many people are visual learners and they need it to be very related to them, and they need it in like a story basis. So let me give you one story because I talk through stories. I have a really good friend of mine. He used to be the chief diversity officer of a major food company. And one day he was going to his retirement company after working at this company for 30 years. And he went out for a run and he thought, hey, let me pick up some sandwiches for me and my wife. And so he goes out, takes sandwiches, but he forgot his keys. And so he goes up to the front desk, and the front desk, attendant asks him, who are those for? And he goes, what do you mean? And he goes, who are those sandwiches for? Thinking that he was, an Uber delivery man or, and so in these little ways, we like to bring in very relevant speakers that can speak to real life experiences that they're having every single day.
Oh, that's great. And it really does make a situation come alive. And you're coaching of executives and others who have to be on platforms. I'm not talking about the integration of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging practices into the person, but as an agent for these for this way of working. How do you help people to become agents in this regard?
It's often a very split thing that we have to do. And when I say that, I mean that within a company, there are different groups of people. And often the information that you provide to C-suite employees has to be different than what you provide to management level employees. And so the coaching is varied across the organization. And so we provide that kind of content across the organization so that each level has actionable plans. A mid-level manager has to, for instance, be aware of performance review biases when they're going into, review their teammates and remember that, hey, I can't be biased because of race, height, gender, beauty, all of these things. And then a C-suite level executive is thinking about different things like, how do I integrate inclusion within my company, but also continue to drive profitability? If I give all my money to employee benefits, is that really helping the company or am I hurting the company? So very strategic questions that, they have to grapple with.
Oh, wow. That's great. And I know one of the things that many of us think about today are multi-generational workplaces, and how we have people from 18 to in their 80s in the workplace. How do we how are you working with that at Backpac?
Yeah, so I think it's very similar to the coaching that we do. So first, again, we go back to the data and we see, hey, is this company mostly composed of boomers, or is it composed of Gen Z, or is it composed of millennials? And we'll often see that, these different demographics will consume media and consume information in a very different way. Boomers will often prefer emails and longer newsletters in written form that they can digest, that has high, like a lot more factual content that, helps them visualize different things. Millennials like to consume smaller bites of information in a very Instagrammable form where they can share things and they can scroll left and right. And then Gen Zers prefer videos. And so we kind of cater to the different levels in which most people, not everyone, consume information.
And there's so many great ways in which we can encourage belonging in an organization. I know that some of the ways that you promote are using communication. So it might be around setting rules for emails and other forms of communication, around promoting team activities, encouraging something called a learn strategy. Can you talk a little bit about those? Maybe whether it's the learn strategy, but to really use communication to promote more belonging in workplaces.
Yeah. So one of the ways is that we help with hiring communications. So when you're recruiting, you have a number of different posts that you might put on different hiring websites that talk about the role, talk about what is needed. And so we work with that text and we see if we can include more inclusion conversations, inclusion words that allow a varied number of people, like a very diverse number of people to apply for the position, because the way in which you describe a position will actually attract certain people to you versus other people. And so we work with those types of communication.
Oh, wow. That's great. And as you do, I assume that what you're also helping to encourage better practices in organizations is around decision making. Because clearly, as you know, and as you state, that diverse teams make better decisions, and some people predict that as high in the high 80s. So I guess part of what you want to do is you want to bring decision making along quickly, so that you can also fail fast. So, what are some of the solutions that you propose to overcome challenges of slow decision making?
Oh, that requires so much organizational change. And so oftentimes it's not a solo project. We'll work with different consulting firms that specialize in change management to discuss with executives on how we can improve processes, but we make sure to emphasize a slow change, step by step. And because often executives will be like, let's change everything right now. Let's just change gears. But the organization itself is not as flexible as, three people at the top saying, hey, we need to change X, Y, and Z. You have to understand from the bottom up that you need to do a mindset change. It's not just implementing new rules. You have to go and you have to help the employees familiarize themselves with these changes and really process what it means to their job, to their future. And then only then can change happen.
And as you continue to work in this area, and a lot of DEIB work, as it does in authentic leadership in my world, I mean, it focuses so much on trust, so that people can bring more of who they are to what they do, so that people can do their best work in places where they feel included. So what are some of the ways that you think about trust in the workplace, and how to build trust among employees for all of the benefits of more productivity, more energy, fewer sick days, better engagement, less stress, more satisfaction, and less burnout? What are some of the ways to build trust among employees?
One of the ways that we build trust is through these social impact events. So we do it in two ways. One is in-person events and two is virtual events. Because everyone is everywhere, time zones are different. You have teams in Asia, you have teams in the US. Our main goal is to bring these teams together so that they at least know the names of two people in the US office or the Singapore office or the Paris office, and to be able to come together and bond and do an activity together. And it's not just any activity like drinking or, something like that, but it's something that's purposeful and meaningful. So one of the events that we recently did was we worked with an NGO that was located in New York. And it was a virtual event where a lot of the team members came on board from different areas of the US and they were giving job training, essentially helping them with interview prep, asking them what it is that they need, sending supplies like suits and ties and things as well, but also really giving mock interviews so that they feel comfortable with what lies ahead. And so by doing this activity, people were able to engage with one another as well. And so that's one of the ways. I think the second is we do a lot of the unconscious biases training, especially with managers, so that when they interact with their teammates, that they can build that individual trust. For instance, one of the ways that we ask them to do it is if an employee is acting out or, not really kind of being engaged in the team, it's to ask questions, it's to ask why. And training these managers to ask the right questions so that you know what is going on with your employees besides the daily work that they have to do.
Well, it's always great to, I think say hello and ask a question.
Yeah.
It's two ways that I always think I'm fond of what two of our colleagues said is that, just saying hello, it's our oldest and best technology. And it is a great way to, build inclusion. But as we think about this too, we have to think about, the barriers to implementing DEIB in organizations. And what might you say, Brenda, about some of the challenges that are faced, and how do we begin to make progress on those challenges?
I think one thing that all companies need to acknowledge is that this work from home culture is not going away. I think we thought that when this shift happened, that we'd all return to the workplace once things normalize. But I think this idea of normal, this new normal, is that people might not come to the office every day of the week. Now they're going to be spread out. And now you need to engage your teammates over the internet, over Zoom. And now we need to shift our thinking and invest in ways that we can do that digitally. And whether that means investing in more technologies that are engaging, that have more emojis and icons and things, or investing in products that allow more connectivity. I think we definitely need to have that shift because it's a global society now, and most companies now have teams in Asia, in Europe, and we need to stay connected.
Oh, that's so wonderful as a way of doing it and thinking about staying connected in a world that where workplaces have certainly changed or evolved. And just on that topic, there is tension around the locus of work and where it takes place. And, should it be fully remote? Should it have some on-campus time? Should it be all in person? Should it be some mix of things? What are you seeing your clients do, and what are your observations in that regard?
So because Backpac works across industries, it's varied. For instance, we have clients in agricultural tech. We have clients in what they call like bedding tech. And basically, each of these companies will have a remote workforce that is working on the analytics, that is working on the technology part. And then they have these production houses and these farms where people actually have to go in daily. And so now it's a question of how do I integrate two types of workforces within my company? Now I have a production side that has this demographic, and I have a farming culture that has this demographic, but now they have to relate to the people in the offices that, come from different backgrounds, are technologically savvy, but they don't understand what's happening outside of that office. And then you also have, in tech, which we work predominantly in, everyone is not coming into the office. And now people are quitting. If you ask them to come into the office, now employees are saying, no, I have other obligations now. I have a family and I've seen the way it can work and I'm very productive. So I'm not going to work at this company. And so people are now very aggressively taking a stand against, what works for their lifestyle. And it's been very interesting to see the evolution of how people are deciding to work.
It's just so great. And I really, there's so much value in the work that you're doing, and all of our listeners can find out about it. And you'll see it in the show notes at backpac.co, backpac.co, and find out about the tremendous work that you're doing, Brenda, along with your associates and colleagues. Just as we wrap up and bring today's episode of the Authentic Change with Mike Horn podcast to a conclusion, what are your top 2 or 3 pieces of advice or guidance to others, whether they're just embarking on their DEIB journeys or whether they're stuck on their DEIB journeys? Are there a couple pieces of advice or guidance that you would offer?
Yes, I have 2 just off the top of my head.
Wonderful.
One is definitely, as stereotypical as this sounds, it's truly ask questions. I think I was very quick to anger in my earlier years at the frustrations of how slow it felt like our society was changing, but it's to continually ask questions. Like, for instance, when the Asian hate was at its peak and, many Asian Americans were getting targeted, it was easy to get angry, but really you have to ask questions of what made those people attack and what is that story, because it's not just one-sided. And the second thing is, I'm going to quote our famous RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she has this quote which says, it's fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. So it goes back to just fight for it, but don't shut people down and don't, close the conversation. Do it in a way where people want to learn and engage with you.
Good trouble, fight the good fight. Those are the things that come to mind with that. And Brenda, it's great that you're doing that work today and advancing it in a way that helps us to build a more just, a more inclusive society where people bring more of who they are to what they do, where they're able to bring their best. And you're certainly doing it in so many wonderful ways. And I hope our audience gets to learn more about you and the work that you do by visiting backpac.co. And it's just been an absolute delight to be in conversation today with Brenda Pak on these important issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So until the next episode of the Authentic Change podcast with Mike Horn, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership, and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horn.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horn.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.